Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Good morning. Today is April 10th. It's 9 a.m. and this is panel number 17946, titled Making Cities and Towns Better for People. I'm Harmon Zuckerman. I'm the moderator today. I'm a partner at Frascona, Joyner, Goodman & Greenstein. It's a firm in Boulder, a law firm that's been around for 50 years this year. I'm a city, regional, and environmental planner. I'm a designer and a builder. I serve the city on the Open Space Board of Trustees, and I formerly served on the planning board and finished as chair of the planning board in 2021. I am recently, and maybe again, adjunct faculty at CU in the Masters of the Environment program, where I've been teaching a class called Governing for Sustainable Communities, and I'm really happy to be here moderating this panel. So before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success and integrating indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One other thing I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure you get a chance to ask questions. Here's how we'll handle the Q&A, and you'll hopefully remember this in 45 minutes. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for that Q&A. I'm aiming for 20 minutes at the end. We're using a note card system to receive questions from you. At any time in this session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. Please write legibly. If you're a student, please note this in your question on the card. When you finish, raise your hand to hand it to the producer, who will bring it up to me. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. And now I'd like to do a brief introduction of each panelist. And for more information, you can find panelists' full bios on the CWA website. So sitting skier's left, looker's right of me is Christine Chang. Christine is a PhD candidate in computer science at the University of Colorado Boulder. She researches human autonomy and human-robot teaming. She's got an undergrad degree from Cornell in mechanical engineering and a master's degree in STEM education from Boise State, and also a master's in computer science from here at CU Boulder. She's worked as an engineer at NASA Johnson Space Center and Boeing Commercial Airplanes, and she's taught grades from kindergarten through college. She's a volunteer firefighter, has a private pilot license, and she likes to apparently run marathons, do a bunch of mountain biking, and she knows what I meant when I said skier's left, because she's a skier too. Okay, so going down the line, Aarian Marshall is a journalist. She's a staff writer at Wired, covering transportation in cities. Her journalism deals with autonomous vehicles, traffic management, mass transit, and urban planning. She's written for Atlantic City Lab and has an AB from Princeton University. She lives in Seattle. Going down to Natalie Stiffler, who is to the left of Our journalist candidate, or our journalist panelist here is Natalie Stiffler. Natalie is the City of Boulder Director of Transportation and Mobility. She, for those of you who know planning circles, she's an AICP certified planner. It's gold standard of the planning profession. She has a BA in Urban Studies and Planning from UC San Diego. She's got her master's in City and Regional Planning and a Master of Science in Engineering from Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. She served on various boards and had several cool jobs, mostly in transportation planning, leading up to her current directorship at the city. She's lived and worked in Boulder for 9 years, but still misses San Diego and her open water swims in La Jolla Cove. She aims to build a world-class transportation system that is safe and for all people and that can be maintained for many years to come. And last but not least, at the far end of the panel is Hunter Leggitt. Hunter is an experiential designer. We'll hear more about that. He's the CEO of his design firm, Hunter Leggitt Studio, which was based in LA, but is now consolidated in Denver with his other firm, which is called the House of Fable. Fable. Thank you. So he's also known as Founder, Chief Artist, and Designer, which is an awesome title. He's a storytelling artist. House of Fable is also an atelier producing world-class drone sky story experiences. They're based in Denver. Hunter specializes in high-end modern design, experiential production design, large-scale artwork, creative direction, and turnkey owner's representation and project management. He's been a designer and project manager in various capacities for the past 20 years or so. He is LEED AP certified by the Green Building Council, and he holds a degree in environmental design and architecture from CU here in Boulder. So I think this is a great group of people. We've got design, project management, journalism, AI, robotics, transportation planning, and we're all gonna kind of synthesize and talk about how all those fields can come together to make cities and towns better for people. And with that as a prelude, I'd like to turn it over to Christine to talk about herself a little bit and give a deeper introduction. And then once we get through introductions, we'll start the discussion. So Christine.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's super exciting for me to be here. When I first found out I was on this panel with all these amazing people, I was like, why am I on this panel? Because I do research in robotics and AI and not urban planning. But I realized that there's so much overlap with how we can design cities and towns to be better for people with my research. So the things that I have been thinking about recently during my PhD include things like chatbots and how people are interacting with autonomous systems. And when I say autonomous systems, I mean things from anything from a chatbot or a large language model or generative AI that you may have heard about recently to things like autonomous vehicles and robots in your home that maybe you have a Roomba or other things connected to the internet that you interact with on a daily basis. And so my research is very much about how we can look at the ways that people interact with these systems and what biases they have for or against them or while they're using them, and how we can mitigate those problems. And also work with them to make them work better for us. So, like I said, I conduct research in human-robot interaction, and so what that really means is I look at the ways that people in various types of situations, from things including like an Amazon fulfillment center to using a chatbot on the internet to using a drone on a battlefield. And we look at how those different interactions can be made better for both the people using them and the people around them. Something else I'll throw in is that I'm very interested in policy and how we can make public policies that kind of encourage responsible use of AI and autonomy. I had a hand in the bill that was passed a few years ago in 2022 that has started to regulate facial recognition use in the state of Colorado. And so that, I think, is definitely relevant to this panel as well.
Thank you very much, Christine. Aarian, would you like to
Sure.
take the next one?
My name is Aarian Marshall. I'm a reporter with Wired. Really glad to be here. At Wired, which is a tech publication, we're really interested in kind of the impacts of technology, and I'm kind of exist in the Venn diagram between tech and transportation. These days, that means a lot of reporting on autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, and those in particular, I'm really interested in the moments in which these kind of amazing, newfangled tech devices come crashing into questions of governance, questions of democracy. In San Francisco, for example, if you haven't been there lately, the streets are really filled with robo-taxis, and these are cars that have truly no one inside, occasionally some passengers inside. That's something that has sort of rankled some of the residents there. And I'm interested in sort of how cities are going to deal with questions about who's allowed to operate on streets and where. In the kind of electric vehicle space, we've been very preoccupied with emissions regulations lately, which sounds really snoozy, but I think is really critical to kind of the future of this country. There's been so much regulation, legislation around electric vehicles in an effort to transition us from these gas-powered cars that are, continuing to cause climate change. Transportation is, I think, the third biggest contributor to climate change in this country, and passenger cars are a really sizable chunk of those. So those are the cars you and I drive every day. And I think how we move folks not into electric vehicles, but other sorts of alternative transportation, whether that's cycling, using your own 2 feet, scooters. I think those are some of the big questions ahead of us. And then I'm also interested in kind of urban planning questions. At Wired, we're again really interested in kind of newfangled tech devices, maglev trains, new kinds of boring machines. But then we also always try to stop and say, hey, is this something that would be better served by something a little lower tech, like a bus system or a bicycle? And I think that's kind of one of the big, maybe the storyline of the decade, if not the century, is how are we going to rethink cities so that they're less focused on cars and how those get around, and more focused on how people get around writ large.
Wow. Very thought-provoking. Thank you. Just imagining Blade Runner and these robo-taxis. Natalie, if you would take the next one.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's really lovely to see all these people that are interested in cities and the future of our cities. I loved so much of what you talked about. I'm so excited to have this conversation. I think some people in the crowd know that I'm kind of a big fan of cities and urban planning, and just the questions around the work that we have ahead of us. So as Harmon said, I'm the Director of Transportation and Mobility with the City of Boulder. Many of you, I'm sure, live here, and so we have a lot of exciting work that we're doing in our community right now, and that we have plans for ahead of us, both locally and regionally. I am really glad, Aarian, you did not say the word gondola. I would say I'm kind of a fan of the lower tech. I'm really interested in questions about autonomous vehicles. I know a lot about kind of what's going on in San Francisco and the Phoenix area. They're really leading the country around kind of the big tech solutions. And I think there's a lot of questions around is that what's best for us from a safe systems approach? In Boulder, we're very focused on safety. Our guiding kind of principle for our transportation network and the way that people get around in our cities and live in our cities is primarily focused on safety. Hopefully you all have heard of the phrase Vision Zero. That's really the focus of our work. And so I think when I think about kind of the future of cities and how we can make them better for people, I understand that big tech will kind of be a part of the arena, but hopefully that's not where we're putting kind of all of our eggs in that basket. I think we, in the city of Boulder, one of our biggest focuses will really be on how do we move a lot of people around our city and in and out of our city, just given the mix of jobs and employment in our city. And for me, folks that know me and hopefully you have seen kind of my priorities are really around public transportation for our city. And that's, for me, I think how we're going to meet our goals, both from a transportation perspective and a climate perspective. So I'm really excited to dig into the conversation. I could go on and on. So I'm going to turn it over to Hunter. Thanks.
Thanks, Natalie. I'm also really excited to be on this panel. I think it's a dynamic cast of characters here, and I'm excited to engage. My name's Hunter Leggitt. I went to school here for architecture, started my career in California, cutting my teeth in mixed-use infill design for developers. I was architect. I transitioned then into design build development, where we were doing kind of our own full turnkey projects down in Southern California. And then that transitioned into production design, shifting from building permanent buildings and permanent experiences into building artistic ephemeral experiences. So I've spent the last 20 years kind of bridging between the built permanent world and the kind of the more of the artistic, creative, ephemeral world. That's taken me all over the world, doing everything from building houses for clients, studying new urbanism, the 15-minute city, and proposing some pretty high concept initiatives for the suburbs and greenfield development, to building large stages and recently starting a company that produces artistic drone shows. So one of the things that's really poignant to me, and I think especially on this topic, is looking at the future, which is easy to take more of a macro stance. But shifting back into what are we talking about? We're talking about livability and sustainability, which really is an individual thing. Having experienced what the limitations, the opportunities, but also limitations of building and creating in the permanent world through architecture and real estate development, and then also experiencing what the opportunities are in the innovation in building temporary cities. We do large productions for music festivals where we'll build a temporary city for about 100,000 people. I do big productions at Burning Man, and that's where I've seen the reduction of red tape and the ability for individuals and communities to blossom and flourish and really test out innovative ways of living and gaining happiness and gaining connectivity. So I think there's alternate ways of looking into how do we approach this topic that come back to maybe reconsidering what we're looking at and what we're studying.
Thanks, Hunter. Thanks, everybody. So I'm going to kick it off with a first question. Hopefully will provoke a conversation amongst the panel. And I just have to say that as a planning practitioner going back 30 years, I've been humbled to see how sometimes the magic in cities is just something that occurs. It's just organic. There's no reason for it that anybody can point to. There's no zoning code that makes it happen. A good example is next to Independence Hall, there are a couple of different squares. They're each a square block. They both have sitting height walls around them, but for some reason every day one of them is filled with people from the local insurance, and publishing industry is eating lunch and going to food trucks, and the other one's just empty. And why? Was it the shadows of the buildings? Was it, some, wind current that is caused by the buildings around it? One square is popular, the other square is not. From an objective perspective, the walls are the same height, they're the same size, they've got the same grassy lawn in the middle of them. So now we have planning, and we have AI, and we're talking about, these ways in which technology and regulation interact. What's the role of people and artificial intelligence in trying to foment those magical places? Anybody can start. Aarian?
Oh, you're calling on me.
Well, you looked like you were ready. If you're not, you can pass the ball.
Well, see, this is the problem, is I am much better at asking questions than answering them, because that's my job. But I would say, I think that's a great question. I'm not sure I know the answer to it. I know that something I sometimes struggle with, I'm from New York City. I'm kind of in New York City's supremacist. This is my big flaw. I grew up in Brooklyn. I didn't grow up driving. I grew up taking the train since I was kind of a middle schooler, and I really thought that was kind of the optimal way to grow up. And something I've really struggled with as I've moved to other cities, lived at other places, is can you so the way the development of the United States worked very quickly is that there were these cities on the East Coast that were developed not for vehicles, and you can really tell that in the grid and the way they're laid out. And then you move further west and you see more and more cities developed with really cars in mind and the commute in mind. And I think a big question is whether we can turn those cities into kind of more human-centered places, places that have a kind of more human scale. I love to walk. That's my favorite way to get around. I would love it if I could. I live in Seattle right now. There are a lot of places I can't access in Seattle, but there are a lot of places I really can't on foot. It's almost impossible. And I think a big question I have, to answer your question with a question, is whether it's possible to bring places back down to that human scale. And I'm really heartened by some things I see in other places. I think Barcelona is a great example. They've been able to use this kind of super block concept to really pedestrianize these big sections of the city. Auto traffic is limited to very specific hours for when, for example, retail folks need to bring things in and out. And they've really turned these parts of the city into these kind of beautiful pedestrianized boulevards where people love to hang out and sit. And I don't know the specifics of how you design a space like that, but I see it happening sometimes, and that makes me feel optimistic about the future.
I guess I'll jump in. I think kind of what I heard in your question, Harmon, was just like, how do people play a role in this change, I think, or in what we want to see? And I think that is, working with the Boulder community and in the Boulder community, it's such a critical piece of how we make change to kind of what we envision a more livable, equitable, sustainable city. Because frankly, especially in Boulder, right, like community engagement is how we get things done. There's a very high expectation around focusing on what the community is interested in, at least from my perspective. And so we really rely on community to drive where we're headed. And I think that means there's so many aspects that kind of drive how people want to live in a livable, equitable, sustainable place. And a lot of that is around what you described, kind of the accessibility piece and like what our land use and transportation network looks like. Because I think the idea for everybody to get to walk and bike around is lovely, right? Like I think we all would say, oh yeah, let's do that. That sounds lovely. But the reality is we need to be able to take our kids to school and to doctor's appointments, and I need to get my mother to the hospital, or there are all these things that come up on a day-to-day basis. And the land use that we've developed, as you described, kind of as we've moved west, that's just not supportive. And so we have, I think, a pretty big task ahead of us, because to get people to want to to travel in this way and to kind of attain this like utopian vision, we need to be able to change the way in which we've developed our, cities. And that to me is critical on community wanting that. And so we need to partner, we need to work hand in hand to make that possible. So I guess that's kind of my perspective on it.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting scenario, and I kind of want to touch on, we're talking about, how do we activate spaces and how do we understand like pedestrian patterns and community patterns. And I mean, if we rewind back to kind of old historic cities, I mean, our favorite cities in Europe, a lot of the cities were planned, but it was more on a natural pattern based on commerce. And there was creation of central civic public spaces that everyone would come to do everything from, listen to whatever sermon, to trading, to selling, to, just establishing community and connecting with people. And I think what we've done, as civilization has progressed and we've become more departmentalized in how do we approach this, it's not just one solution that looks at all aspects and looks at a best solution. It's individual departments that are kind of prescriptive in nature, a little bit more academic of how do we do city planning. And it may not be necessary, it may be appropriate to a large city, it may be appropriate to a small town. If you look at, for here, what do we do with Idaho Springs and like the central street of that? How do we activate that better than it has been historically versus what do we do in downtown Denver or Boulder? There's different approaches. And I think one of the things that we have done, like it or not, with the planning departments is try to create design guidelines for how do we approach these projects, these situations from civic to private. And I think there's, when we start talking about technology, I think there's a really fascinating chapter that we're turning into, and we're already seeing you can, as a business owner, you can purchase statistics on walkability from firms that are, somewhere online that are harvesting GPS data from your phone, and wherever you're walking or biking in a city, they're tracking you. Surprise, surprise. And they know exactly where people are walking. And they know where the dead zones are, and they know where the live zones are. The same with driving. So Google owns everything, and all these tech companies do. So I think there's a fascinating opportunity. Instead of looking at it as like invasion of privacy, look at it as like, how do we now take this incredible data and these metrics and start using those to influence urban planning? And do we need to create a plaza in this development over here, just because the zoning code says we need to carve out a space, but nobody goes over there? And same with a bike lane. Like, we can study all this with the data that we have access to now and start influencing decisions. And maybe that requires a paradigm shift in how we think about our policy, the policy and how that's influencing our towns and cities. So I think it's actually a really exciting period, and we should embrace it.
I'm glad you brought up the data aspect, because that's exactly where my brain went. Computers, one thing they're really good at is finding patterns that even humans can't find. And you said, there's sometimes things just happen that are very unintentional. That was not planned this way, but why can't we make that unintentional more intentional? We can look at, okay, well, what are the areas that are like the one you described, where people are gathering, and find out what that looks like in the data. We can look at satellite pictures and phone information, and we can see where people are gathering and understand more about why they're gathering in those spaces, and then make more spaces like those. I think that is a really important thing to be thinking about as we design newer and better cities.
Wow. That's interesting. Does anybody have any follow-ups?
Yeah, I guess I do. I mean, I think this is just a really good point, and we've kind of done that in like a low-tech way in city planning for a while around, when we see kind of what we call a social trail, right? Like if we see that somebody is many people are using, walking in a certain way or biking in a certain way. We take that as, a data point to say, okay, we probably need to make a better connection here and make it a more safe and comfortable experience for the people that are doing this. So we've done that in a low-tech way for a long time. I think the kind of new AI data and like cell phone tracking, that's becoming more part of like our industry practice. We partner with a couple companies in the city of Boulder to be able to look at where people are traveling. We are tracking your cell phone data to see how you're coming into the city and leaving the city, and that informs, kind of at a macro scale, how people are traveling in and out of Boulder, and also gives us kind of data at different times of day and what corridors people are using, and that can inform how can we make it more convenient to use potentially other multimodal transportation options, and relieve some of the congestion on our streets and make it a more livable place. So I think that's coming. It's becoming more of the norm, but I'm sure there's a lot of opportunity that we haven't tapped into yet.
I think I'll just say one more thing.
Yeah.
This is a double-edged sword, and I think the caveat in looking at too much data is that we start becoming engineers. And human civilization has proven that we are great engineers. But engineering doesn't necessarily connect with the human soul and happiness and livability, and I think that's kind of this dynamic conversation of like, how do we match technology and our access to it to actually what we really want, and do we want that? So is it just a tool, or is it the driving force of what and how we do stuff?
Yeah, and I'll. Oh no, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, let's not do two in a row. So go ahead, Christine.
So I'm an engineer. I think I have a soul. No,
We're
too.
now seeing the age-old battle: cats, dogs, engineers, planners. It just never ends. Go ahead, Christine.
No, I think I'll use this opportunity to kind of advocate for something else that I'm really passionate about, which is, improving, the way that we educate engineers to be thinking about those kinds of things, right? I think there are a lot of places that do this really well, and we need to kind of expand that and help our new engineers, build diverse teams that are able to think in these terms and consider different perspectives and ways that the product is going to impact everybody, and not just the diverse team, but then the person themselves. How are they? What are they considering, and making sure that they're taking into account all of the things that you are also thinking about. So.
Okay, so before I go to Natalie, Aarian, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, quickly, one thing that this is kind of bringing up for me is, and I'd be interested to hear about how you all deal with this in your work, is when it comes to using data for planning purposes, I speak to a lot of people who are very frustrated with their city planning departments. Of course, every city planning department works very differently. But
people are frustrated.
Yeah. People are frustrated is the headline here. With how reactive their planning departments are, and when it comes to the use of data, especially in the context of safety, they'll say, hey, planning department, this corner is really not working out. I've seen a lot of near misses, cars almost hitting pedestrians, cars almost hitting each other, and it kind of goes on the back burner because nothing has happened yet, and it's only when that crash happens, when someone gets hurt or a car gets totaled, and it happens a few times, that the city would really start paying attention. So I'm always interested in kind of the balance of using data, but also trying to kind of see past the data, see what the data will reveal in the future. Is there a way to balance what's happening with what should be happening?
So Natalie, why don't you give us the last one on this question, and then we'll move on.
So I was actually, there was something you said, Hunter, that I think about just like the soul of people, and I was thinking about like what's complex, I guess, and difficult in cities is that everybody kind of has that different individual perspectives, and like their needs and desires are different, right? And so that's why it's so hard to do this work and to, I think, improve cities, is because there's so many trade-offs. Like, people want different things, and those things are often in conflict with one another. At least, that's my experience in working in this city. And then just the final thing I'll say around not just reacting to data. I think we really have learned that, and that is new, I would say, in just the last few years in our practice around cities, to be, we call it a safe systems approach, but essentially it's like proactive work to look at patterns that are happening, that we've seen on the system, and things that contribute to unsafe interactions, so that we can do work before the crash happens or before the fatality happens. And so, but that's new, that's very new, and I'd say we're on the forefront of that.
So I want to just jump to a slightly related, different topic, and I was going to say that since COVID and the change, we've seen a lot of changes in working, commuting, living patterns, and so our panel is about how do we make better cities and towns, and I wanted to ask, given the what are the opportunities that these new working and living patterns have opened up to us as planners and thinkers about bettering cities? And when we talk about these, when we think about these opportunities that have been opened up by the new patterns, let's also look at this through an equity lens, because not every facet of society has been the beneficiary of some of these new patterns. So I'll open it up to whoever gets their mouth to the mic first. Or I'll call on you.
I mean, I'll start. I think the new patterns that you're referring to kind of circulate around the work from home and not commuting as much, going to an office, figuring out that there is more potential happiness in just staying put, not spending so much inefficient time in typical life and transition. I think this goes back to the concept of new urbanism in the 15-minute city, and it's not, there are great examples out there of small kind of jewel box projects like Seaside in the 80s, Serenbe outside of Atlanta, just north of here, Prospect Park in Longmont, and these were in our communities that are designed with all of the services, as many services and as many requirements of just daily life within 15 minutes of a walk. You don't have to get in a car and drive. And I think these models have become more valuable and more pertinent than ever now, especially in the wake of COVID, and I think should be really focused on, and how we scale those up to a city level. I think we need to look at affordability, housing, and the inclusion of accessory dwelling units, higher density lots. What are appropriate zoning densities for redeveloping neighborhoods? What are the commercial services and the commercial zones that are created within each district? And in large cities, you obviously have an urban core. That's not necessarily accessible by all. That's accessible by people who live downtown, but people aren't driving into downtown anymore to go to dinner. They need dinner within their neighborhood, and they'd prefer to walk there, walk their dog, bike, use their e-bike. So I think where these new patterns of people moving around are kind of coming back in more like tribal setups of communities, and how do we go back to not looking at necessarily as what's appropriate for the whole city and just taking a macro look, but looking at a more neighborhood basis, and providing the services, providing everything that you need to live, work, and be happy.
Go for it.
Okay. So I guess on the equity front, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I think we recently did some surveying in the city of Boulder to look at kind of the impacts of essentially COVID on how people are traveling. And we learned that more people are in Boulder, at least, right, are working from home. And so it's interesting, since 2020 and really probably we didn't really start talking about looking at increasing transit service levels or public transportation service levels until 2021 or 2022, after we'd recovered from just the fallout of COVID. But I got a lot of questions from people like, well, are we going to need transit anymore? Do we need to invest in bus service and transit lines or a transit station? Why would we do that? Nobody's riding buses anymore. And that was pretty challenging for me to hear, because there is such a huge segment of people that through COVID and after COVID are still relying on our public transportation system. And so as we look to continue to invest in our transportation and transit system, those are really the folks that are at the core of, from my perspective, why we need to prioritize that. And that's beyond Boulder, right? That's folks that are coming into Boulder for jobs every day that can't afford to live in our city, and so they're living in surrounding cities, but they still need to come in every day. And many of the jobs that they're working are low-paying or low-wage jobs, and so they can't afford to live in Boulder, and they also need to rely on public transportation. And frankly, I think, want folks to be traveling into our city on public transportation. That's how we're going to continue to meet our climate goals, and also for a more livable city from a street space perspective. So I think it's super important that we continue to just think about that equity piece and all the work that we do. Certainly, even on the AI side, I have a lot of questions and I think concerns around autonomous vehicles. But I think there's opportunity there from an equity standpoint at some point way, way, way down the road, that there's potentially just mobility options in that. And so that's not super directly related to the COVID experience and kind of the impacts from all of that, but I think when I think about equity, that's a potential tool. And I think so much, the final thing I'll just say is that so much of what we do is how do we pair up all these tools that we have, all the strategies. There's not one silver bullet to the panacea, right? We're going to need to use multiple tools in our toolbox to be able to solve our problems, and equity being, at the forefront of that.
It's interesting to hear you say that, Natalie, because that's something I've heard from other city transportation leaders all over the country, which was that the pandemic was really kind of clarifying for the public transit systems. There's been so much talk, I think, in the past 20 years or so about the quote-unquote choice commuter. So really focusing on how you transition people out of cars, onto buses, onto trains. And I think for a lot of cities, the pandemic was an important reminder that the core, the folks that are often being served there are folks who are not choosing to not drive a car because they don't have a car, or they can't drive a car for various reasons, or they're a lower income population. And I think a lot of cities have sort of doubled down on serving those folks and starting to think, having less kind of commuter-centric thinking around how they're building out their transit systems. And it'll be interesting to see how cities kind of thread the needle there in terms of getting more people on public transit, but also remembering that at heart, transit is a social service that really needs to serve the needs of a very specific population.
Yeah, I'll just echo two things. So in terms of autonomous vehicles, to increase equity, there was just last year a hearing before the US Congress where various people from different organizations representing disabled people who might be blind or visually impaired or unable to drive a car for other reasons were highly advocating for autonomous vehicles. And yes, we need, better guidelines and guardrails around how these are going to be used and deployed in our cities. But this is essential for lots of people. And just from a personal standpoint, I am one of the people who was certainly impacted when, buses weren't used as much, or, the bus service was decreased because there was lower ridership during the pandemic. And, I'm currently a graduate student on graduate student pay, and I live in subsidized housing effectively. I live here on campus in graduate student housing, and I take advantage of these things, and I do believe that, I'm contributing to the community. I am a valuable part of this community, and other people who are using those resources are as well.
So it's getting close to question time from the audience, and I'm going to kind of blend a question that I have with a question that came in from a student. So as a preamble, I think one of the the elephant in the room in some respects in Boulder is just the vast amount of single-family residential zoning that we have, which isn't conducive to the kind of walkable neighborhoods that a higher density zoning system would be. And I've thought long and hard about ways that we could come up with systems to prioritize certain critical corners in single-family neighborhoods for conversion to some sort of neighborhood serving public retail, public facility. People who sit in their cars for years and years suddenly have an extra hour when they work at home, and now maybe they just spend the hour in their car driving to their favorite coffee shop. And so what I've often thought about is, what's the role of delight in planning? How do we make a planning code or a zoning code actually foment delight on the part of the people who live in a city? We all know what delight is. We go to San Gimignano when we're visiting Italy, and it's delightful, but we come home and we want single-family zoning in Boulder. So I guess the question is, besides what's the role of delight in making cities better, making towns better, this is the student question, how do we differentiate what we think we want in a city versus what we actually want? Is there a method of community personal discovery that can set us along such path?
I'll start, because
Great.
yeah. So I mean, I think this is a very political question, right? Like, what role does our government have, or the people who are actually wielding the money and doing the work to plan the cities? What is their role in telling us what it is that we really want? And this is a question that I struggle with a lot as someone who's very interested in public policy and working in that region. So I think it has to be a balance, right? So Natalie talked about community engagement, and I think that that's exactly what this is. Like, you have to go into the community and see what it is that people say they want, and say that they do in the ways that people say they act. And then you also look at the data and say, well, okay, you say you want, whatever, I don't know. You can all come up with better examples than I can. But the traffic patterns show that this is not how you are utilizing this space, or your use of this these trails or this open space is showing that you're not using it the way that you say you are. And so it has to be some combination of those. With an eye to the future, right? Like, how is this city going to be growing? How are people going to be changing? I think, I don't have any answers, but those are, I guess, some of the thoughts I have.
Thank you.
I think one thing that COVID has taught us is that we're really good at isolating ourselves. And I think, the American dream with a big house, the big pull-in garage at the front, a big wide front yard, big wide street in front, and a big gated rear yard with a trampoline and a swimming pool and a barbecue. That's what everyone wanted, and I think that's what, was sold to us. And we probably know about the highway expansion and how the suburbs originally kind of got developed, and it was a marketing tool. So we were sold this American dream, and it looked like this. And that's greatly what has continued to exist in the built environment for the past 60 years. You have, the suburbs continuing to grow, low density, Boulder's low density, and we all have big spaces, big living rooms, tons of bedrooms, way too much room. And now we have Zoom, we have our phones, we have all these ways of thinking that we're connected and thinking that we're a community participant, but actually we're just in our nice cushy house with our Netflix. And I think, there's an interesting, it's a bringing in community input. Yes, absolutely. Bringing in policymakers' input, absolutely. But this is also conditioned, and we think we know what it is. There are many, many, many cities, communities, cultures existing in this world right now that do not have, the privilege and the status of being a first world country, of having 2 cars, of having a big house, of having access to trails, of having freedom to move around however they want. But I was in an Uber the other day with a gentleman from Senegal, and I was talking to him, and he said, "You have to come visit." It's the happiest man I've met in a long time. "You have to come visit. You will absolutely love it here." And he's from Drakkar. He goes back there 4 times a year. His wife works for United. He says, and I was asking him about it. I'm like, "How's the community there?" He's like, "I know literally everyone." He's like, "I'd bring you to Senegal, and you would meet the entire city. And they're the happiest people. And they live in tiny little shoeboxes. But they're always out about with their community. They're not isolated in their housing." So I think we need to look at this and potentially reconsider what is quality of life. And when we look at planning and policy, and we look at Boulder, since we're here, do we really want this low density, individuated housing, big property type of thing? Or do we want to start reconsidering that and look towards other places that maybe have a bit more happiness and connectivity?
Yeah.
I can jump in. I definitely agree with you, and also it's just hard. I work in this community every day. I know the folks that live here, and it's it's really hard for me to kind of like reckon with the idea of just that the students' question of like, what do people think they want versus what they really want. I think, and I think you're right. The conditioning plays a huge piece in that. So how do we confront that, I guess, and try to get past it? And I think one of the ways we do that in our work in Boulder is talk to youth. Because they haven't been fully conditioned yet, I think. Hopefully not. And so when we're thinking about what do we do with our park spaces, with our streets, with our land use, hearing from youth, I think is so important. And we have an amazing organization in Boulder that we're very lucky to have that we can work with growing up Boulder. And what I see from that is they approach just their kind of vision for the community that they want to live in with delight, right? Like that's the first thing that comes to mind. I asked she just turned 5, my middle child, Louise, to plan out like a park just for fun, a map of a park. And she put, all the things you would think of in a park. And then she put a bathroom and she circled it and like big, bolded the bathroom. And I shared that with one of my colleagues at the city and she thought it was hilarious. And also like so, natural and just, I think it is what people need, right? And what they desire. And also it's not really like, I don't think people are coming to a meeting and saying like, I'm going to need a bathroom here, right? Like, but a 5-year-old tells you that. A 5-year-old's like, I need a toilet. And so I really think it's so incumbent on us to really look to our youth to figure out what are we going to do with the future. And then I think just second thing I'll say is around just trying things. I think that has been critical for us in our community and in many communities across the country. It gives us that opportunity to maybe find delight without the permanence of it. And I think the permanence is what scares people, and so they can't get to the place of delight. And so I'm a huge fan of trying things. I know in this community sometimes we say we're going to try things, and then pilots have kind of a weird word in this community. But I do think that that's an important piece of it. How do we just test something and see, does this work for us? Is it going to be something good for our community? And so I encourage that.
Yeah, that's great. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I'd say I think part of it is just, this is like as far from a policy prescription as we could get, but it's sort of just asking people to be a bit more thoughtful about what they want. In theory, I would love to, I live in a 1-bedroom apartment. I'd love like an office. I'd love, a place to work out in my home. I'd love a den where I can watch TV and pull down all the window shades. But when I really think through what that would mean for me to live in that place, that would mean I'd live in a place that was probably far away from public transit. I would need more room. It would mean living in a place that didn't have a little grocery store downstairs where I could pop down to get an apple or a snack or milk if I need it for the recipe I'm working on. And I think, speaking of kind of talking to young people, I hear so much frustration from young people about kind of lack of community, really kind of struggling to get out of isolation. They say, I feel chained to my phone. I don't want to live this way. And really thinking through what a city that didn't keep you chained to your phone would look like, what it would really look like to build community and live close to people. I think just encouraging folks to really think through what that looks like, and as you said, kind of the trade-offs there, and what's worth it is a kind of a valuable exercise.
I have one other thing to add. I studied, one of kind of my hobbies in COVID was to study urban planning in the suburbs and see if there was some sort of like futuristic vision of how we could redirect some notions and make bold moves. And one of the concepts that was really poignant to me during COVID was there was nobody driving around. So there's all this real estate in front of your house, and the kids are back playing in the streets. There's people walking down the middle of the street with their dogs. Like, it was an activated space again. And, a couple of years out now, it's back to a vacant, dead zone. And this is in residential neighborhoods. This isn't in the core. And one of the things that we studied was, and especially if in existing neighborhoods that have alleyways and access to, a car park in the back, okay, you have access. Potentially also access for fire trucks. Well, you have a tremendous amount of right-of-way in front, sometimes 80 feet or more between property line and property line. And it's vacant. Again, it's dead. And this is a tremendous amount of percentage in the low-density residential districts. What if you were to take bold moves, close a street, tear it up, and rewild it, turn it into a green space? Would that increase people, the residents' connection with each other, with their neighbors? Would they use that? Or do they literally have to drive 10 minutes to go to a park? Could they walk their dogs? I think we need to take, and I think this is more of a general thing, we need to have bolder moves, bolder interventions, test stuff, experiment it. And European countries and other countries, Eastern Asia, are great with just saying, screw this, let's try it. And I think we've gotten a little bit too comfy here in saying, we need to go through all of these channels to identify stuff, do expensive studies, talk to lawyers. Let's just do it. And Boulder's a great place. I think Boulder loves to be progressive. So tear up some of that wasted space and turn it into a park. Like, make it usable again, make it activated.
Hey. Inspirational. Were you going to say something, Christine?
We can go to the next question.
Okay. Well, no, I mean, I think they're great examples of that. I'm going to just pitch in for a second, Hunter. I grew up in a kind of rough neighborhood in the southwest corner of Center City, Philadelphia, and south of me was this neighborhood that's known as the Devil's Pocket. And there was a lot of vacancy, a lot of crime. There were 4 blocks that had brick sidewalks, no street, and a central park strip that was full of garden. And in this, sort of quasi-ghetto, these blocks were intact. There were no houses that were unoccupied, knocked down, and I think there was a lot more neighborhood pride, and people they cooperated with each other to keep those gardens. So, those ideas, they have real examples out there that we can look at, and I'd love your call to be adventurous like that. So, any other thoughts on this
I'll
now?
add one more
Okay,
thing.
thank you.
So call back to your Burning Man experience. Like, I think that there is a very direct link between what you describe and how pedestrians and cyclists are prioritized at Burning Man. You can't drive more than 5 miles per hour, right? And so the city is huge, right? It takes you, a significant amount of time to walk from one end to the other, but people do it because you're gonna walk, and then you meet people, and there's community, and you can also ride your bike and see things a little bit faster, but you're not in a car secluded from everybody else trying to get from point A to point B as fast as possible. The point is to foster community, and I think it's very much about what you're prioritizing and making that choice very consciously.
For those of you who don't know, Burning Man is a temporary city that exists one time a year, 70,000 people in the middle of a desert in Nevada. It has every single department, fire department, hospitals, police, everything. So it works. And I think there's some fascinating, again, go bold, study stuff that isn't the textbook way of doing it, which has been, an iterative process over a long time. Take some bold moves.
And I'll just say, I think on the Burning Man idea, I think there's a lot to learn from that. And also it's anti-capitalistic, right? And so, back to the conditioning in our society, right? Like, so much of what our daily choices are and what we think we need is driven by the society that we've been conditioned to live in, and that's why this work is so challenging, right? And I know I keep saying that, but it's because it's like huge systems of change that have to occur for us to be able to get to this place that we all know is where we need to get to, from a livability and quality of life, and just to meet our climate goals. And it's just hard. It's huge systems that need to change. And that's why Burning Man works, because everyone has agreed going into that we're not participating in that system. So it's just an interesting reflection.
This is the challenge of democracy. Yeah.
Well, I want to take a second just to thank everybody, both here and virtually, for coming. This is really, really heartening to see all you folks, and I've got way too many questions. If we were to take 10 minutes a question, we'd be here till it's dinner time at least. So now we're 6 or 8 minutes from the end, and I'm going to play a dirty trick on the panel, and I'm going to ask them one of these giant sort of existential questions, and then tell them that it's a lightning round. So does zoning still play a positive role in our ever-changing cities? Take it where you wish. I can tell Aarian's got it.
As a good bureaucrat, I'll say yes.
Okay, that's a little too lightning for this round. Please elaborate, or turn it over to Aarian's got her mouth. She looks like she's ready to go.
Oh, it's the opposite. My understanding is that the city of Houston doesn't have a ton of zoning regulations.
correct.
I think if you want a real life example of what happens when there's not a lot of regulation, you can look at Houston. If you like that, then yes. And if you don't like that, no.
Okay, but Houston is also a city that suffers from the affordability crisis less than every other major city in the United States, thanks to not having zoning. So, push and pull here. And I'm a planner.
Zoning's necessary. I mean, it has to happen. There's too many oppository forces that would just come in and do whatever that wasn't beneficial for anyone. Again, through our capitalist, society. I think zoning, again, I mean, I'm not some anti-capitalist or crazy libertarian, but I really think these systems need to be shaken up, and they need to bring in new stakeholders to providing input. And the community is a great one, but again, cooks in the kitchen. Like, who are the professionals? Who's studying this? Who is knowledgeable? Who's PhD in it? Who's touring the world, seeing the best use cases currently, not 10 years ago, not 20 years ago, not 80 years ago, but hey, maybe 2,000 years ago. There are some great examples that worked. And I think that it's zoning should be malleable. And I think, my opinion is that, city policy, especially around planning department and anything that involves the built environment, so influenced by capitalistic forces and also legal aspects of it, of just what, how do we, I could talk forever on this, but.
Anybody else?
I guess I'll piggyback on that and just say that knowing next to nothing about zoning and having lived in Houston, I think there's a happy medium. Like, we can figure out ways to make the laws more flexible and dynamic so that we can work with, how the different neighborhoods are evolving. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just, I guess, elaborate on my yes. I agree with a lot of just what's been said. I think and we are learning that in Boulder. I think we, in fact, have a new zone, something our planning director would probably shame me for not knowing what it's called. I think it's like funky flexible or something. So I think we're trying to get more flexible and recognizing that there is a system in which we're working, and so zoning is probably necessary to really also protect people in ways, right? Like from just the opposing kind of forces that would occur. And also there's a recognition that we probably don't want to continue with 75% of our land use being dedicated to single family uses, right? And so we need to figure that out.
Okay. Well, we got just a couple minutes left, so does anybody have any parting thoughts that they want to impart about making our cities and towns better for people? We can maybe just go down the line. You want to start, Christine?
Oh man, all right.
Another little lightning round, but
Sure.
Just a little parting thought.
Yeah, I guess I'll share something that I've been thinking about this whole panel. So I recently ran a research study where I had people use a chatbot and then tell me about how they used it, and I kind of threw some weird things at them. I made the chatbot not completely honest, and I asked them about how much they trusted it and what they thought, in general about chatbots like ChatGPT and things like this. And pretty much everyone was like, yeah, you really shouldn't trust them. They're not very trustworthy. I would, you should check their information. And many of these people, almost all of them, at least at some point, just flat out trusted it. They decided, okay, this is fine. I'm just going to use this information. And so why I think this is relevant here is because I think people don't know what they don't know, and they don't always do what they say they're going to do. And so these are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about when, well, all the time, but when we're planning cities.
Thank you. Aarian, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just kind of going to echo that, which I think the big question here, which was a student question, I think is a great one that I'm going to keep thinking about, is how do you know what you want? And I hope to be a little bit more thoughtful about that in my own life. And I think it's a really difficult question going forward, and I think some kind of a subtext here that we haven't explicitly hit on, but it's often when we talk about community input, we're talking about the input of folks who have the time and resource to show up and really give their input. And I think governments have been much more proactive recently about reaching out to a kind of broader subset of people who live in many different parts of a community. And I think continuing to question, what exactly you want, but also just making sure that more people's preferences are heard rather than just the folks who have the time to show up and talk is kind of a worthy thing to invest time and money in.
Thank you. Listen, Hunter and Natalie's parting thoughts are thank you very much. We're at time. And I want to thank you too, because it's been great to have this discussion in front of you all. So enjoy the rest of the conference, and we hope you enjoyed this panel.